Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. My name is Corin Bleakley, and I've been a funeral director for 19 years. People think this job is about grief counseling and flower arrangements, but really it's about control. Not the kind that makes you feel powerful, the kind that keeps things from sliding into chaos when everyone around you is falling apart. You learn early on that families don't remember the eulogy or the hymns. They remember whether the casket stayed shut, whether the body looked peaceful, whether anything went wrong during the 2 hours they needed to say goodbye. I'm telling you this because what happened last Thursday wasn't about grief. It was about physics, about weight distribution and temperature regulation and the particular way a viewing platform can shift when someone leans too hard against the railing. That's what I keep telling myself. That's what I wrote in the incident report. But I'm also the one who had to stand there for 90 minutes watching it happen. And I'm the one who has to go back into that chapel tomorrow morning and set up for another service. So, maybe I need to say it out loud to someone who wasn't there. Maybe that's the only way I'll stop seeing it when I close my eyes. The family arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Extended family, the kind that fills both sides of a small chapel and spills into the hallway. The deceased was a woman in her early 70s, former schoolteacher, died in her sleep. Natural causes, no trauma. We'd done good work on her. Restorative care was minimal, just a little foundation to even out the skin tone and some work around the eyes where the lids had sunken slightly. She looked like herself. Peaceful, exactly what the family had requested. We'd dressed her in a navy blue dress with a white collar, hands folded across her abdomen, a small silver cross tucked between her fingers. Standard presentation. I'd checked everything twice that morning. The casket was a mid-range oak model with a champagne-colored interior, hinges oiled, lid tested for smooth operation. The viewing platform was the same one we'd used for 3 services that week. Solid, level, locked into place with the same steel pins we always used. The son was the first one to approach the casket. He was in his 40s, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who looked like he'd done physical work his whole life. He stood there for a long time, just staring down at her face. Didn't cry. Didn't speak. Just stood there with his hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched. His wife joined him after a minute, and then the daughter, and then a steady stream of cousins, neighbors, friends. I stood in the back of the chapel near the door, hands clasped in front of me, the way I always do. Close enough to help if needed, far enough to give them space. The air conditioning was running on the lower setting. We keep it cool during viewings to slow any potential changes in the body, but not so cold that people complain. 68 degrees. I checked the thermostat twice. Around 2:45, I noticed the first shift. It was small. So small I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. The woman's left hand, the one resting on top of the right, seemed to have moved slightly. Not lifted, not grasping. Just rotated a fraction of an inch, enough that the edge of her thumb was now touching the side of the cross instead of resting flat against her palm. I watched it for a full 30 seconds, trying to decide if the angle of light from the stained glass window had changed, or if someone brushing past the platform had caused a vibration I hadn't felt from where I was standing. Neither explanation felt right, but I didn't move toward the casket. You don't interrupt a viewing unless something is actively wrong, and a hand shifting a 1/4 inch doesn't qualify. Bodies settle. It's normal. Tissue relaxes, Joints release tension. Gravity does its work. I've seen it 100 times, but I kept watching. The son had moved to one of the pews, and now an older woman, maybe a sister, was standing at the casket, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. She leaned forward slightly, and I saw her lips moving. A prayer, probably, or just talking to the deceased the way people do when they need to say something they never got to say in life. She stayed there for maybe 3 minutes, and when she stepped back, I saw it again. This time it was the right hand. The fingers had curled inward just slightly, like someone had brushed a feather across her palm, and the muscles had responded on reflex. But there's no reflex in a dead body. Not after 3 days. Not after embalming. The formaldehyde stops all of that. Locks everything down. It's not like the movies where corpses twitch and jerk. Real death is still. Permanent. That's the whole point of what we do. I crossed the room slowly, keeping my expression neutral. I've learned over the years that if you look worried, families notice. They start asking questions. They start doubting whether you did your job correctly. So I kept my face calm, my pace measured, like I was just making a routine check. When I reached the platform, I stood to the left side of the casket, angled so I could see both the body and the room. Up close, the change was undeniable. Both hands had shifted. Not dramatically, but enough that the symmetry we'd carefully arranged was gone. The left thumb was now pressed against the side of the cross, and the right hand had curled enough that you could see the tendons standing out slightly beneath the skin. I reached out slowly, carefully, and adjusted the left hand back into position. The skin was cool, firm, exactly the texture it should be. No warmth, no softness. I repositioned the fingers, made sure the cross was centered again, and stepped back. The daughter approached a moment later. She was younger than the son, maybe late 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a braid. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, daisies, and black-eyed Susans, the kind you pick from a field rather than buy from a florist. She set them gently on the edge of the casket near the woman's shoulder and stood there with her hand resting on the polished wood. I watched her face, watched for the moment she'd notice something was off. But she didn't. She just stood there, crying quietly, her fingers drumming a slow, unconscious rhythm against the wood. That's when I felt it. A vibration. Faint, low, like the hum you get when a truck drives past on the street outside. But there was no truck. No one walking heavily across the floor. No one moving chairs or leaning against the walls. I looked down at the platform. Solid. Locked. The steel pins were flush with the base, exactly as they should be, but the vibration continued. I could feel it in my heels, a subtle tremor that made the floor feel less stable than it had 5 minutes ago. I glanced toward the back of the room where my assistant was standing. He's been with me for 4 years, steady, reliable, not the kind to panic. I caught his eye and gave a small nod toward the platform. He noticed. I could tell by the way his posture shifted, the way his hands came out of his pockets. He started moving toward the front, slow and casual, like he was just coming up to check the guest book. Good. If something was about to go wrong, I wanted someone else close enough to help. The daughter stepped back, wiping her eyes, and the son returned to the casket. He stood there for a long moment, then did something I didn't expect. He leaned forward and kissed his mother's forehead. It's not uncommon. People do it all the time during viewings. But the movement put weight on the front edge of the casket, and I saw the platform shift. Just a fraction. A slight tilt forward, maybe half a degree. Not enough to cause the casket to slide, but enough to change the angle of the body inside. The woman's head rolled. Not a lot, maybe an inch to the left, but it was visible. The son didn't seem to notice. He'd already stepped back, his hand over his mouth, shoulders shaking. But I noticed. And so did the assistant, because I saw him stop mid-step, his eyes locked on the casket. I moved quickly, stepping up beside the son and placing a hand on his shoulder. Gentle. Supportive. The kind of touch that says, "I'm here, you're not alone." He looked at me, his face crumpled with grief, and I guided him back toward the pews. Then I returned to the casket. The head had definitely moved. The chin, which had been centered, was now angled slightly toward the left shoulder. The mouth, which we'd carefully set with a bit of adhesive and internal support, looked looser. Not open, but not as firmly closed as it had been. I glanced at the assistant. He saw it too. I could tell by the way his jaw tightened. I reached into the casket and gently repositioned the head. It took more effort than it should have. The neck was stiff. Rigor mortis had come and gone days ago, but the embalming process leaves tissue firm, resistant. I had to apply steady pressure to rotate the head back to center, and when I did, I felt something give. Not a crack, not a tear. Just a subtle release, like a joint settling into place. I stepped back, checked the alignment, and adjusted the collar of her dress to make sure nothing looked disturbed. The son was still in the pew, his face in his hands. No one else seemed to have noticed. Good, that's the goal. Keep it invisible. Keep it smooth. Let them remember her at peace, not the small mechanical failures of a body that stopped working. But the vibration didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. I could feel it now, not just in the floor, but in the platform itself. A low, steady hum, like something underneath was running. I knelt down, pretending to adjust one of the floral arrangements at the base of the platform, and examined the pins. Still locked, still secure. I ran my hand along the edge of the platform, feeling for any give, any instability. Nothing. Solid as ever. But the hum continued. I stood up slowly, brushed off my knees, and walked back to my position near the door. The assistant joined me a moment later. He leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. Something's wrong with the platform. I didn't look at him, just kept my eyes on the room. I know. Should we stop the viewing? I considered it, weighed the options. If we stopped now, we'd have to explain why. We'd have to move the casket, reposition everything, possibly delay the service. Families don't forget that kind of disruption. It plants a seed of doubt, makes them wonder if something went wrong with the preparation, if the body wasn't treated properly, if we made a mistake. And I didn't know that something was wrong. Not really. The platform was stable. The casket wasn't moving. The body had shifted a little, but that's normal. That's explainable. I shook my head. Not yet, just keep watching. The next 20 minutes passed without incident. More people approached the casket, said their goodbyes, stepped away. The daughter returned with her husband, and they stood there together, holding hands. The son brought his children up, 2 young boys who stared at their grandmother with wide, uncertain eyes. I kept my position near the door, but my attention never left the platform. The vibration hadn't stopped. It was still there, faint but persistent, like a current running through the floor. And then, just after 3:15, I saw the hands move again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The right hand, which I'd repositioned twice already, lifted. Not much, maybe half an inch. But it lifted, the fingers extending slightly, and then it settled back down in a new position. Palm up, fingers slightly curled, like she was holding something invisible. I moved immediately. Didn't run, didn't rush, just walked with purpose across the chapel and positioned myself at the side of the casket. The son looked up at me, confused. "Is everything all right?" I nodded, gave him a calm smile. "Just making sure everything stays in place. Sometimes the fabric shifts during viewings." He accepted that. People usually do. They don't want to think too hard about the mechanics of death. I adjusted the hand again, pressing it firmly back into position, and this time I used a small pin, the kind we keep for securing fabric, to anchor the sleeve of her dress to the lining of the casket. It's not something we usually do, but I needed to know if the hand moved again. If it did, the fabric would pull, and I'd see it immediately. I stepped back, checked the overall presentation, and returned to my position. The assistant caught my eye. I could see the question there, the concern, but I just shook my head. Not yet. We were 40 minutes into a 90-minute viewing. We could manage. We had to. At 3:30, the pastor arrived. He was an older man, thin and soft-spoken, the kind who'd probably spent his whole life in small congregations. He approached the family first, offering condolences, and then moved to the casket. He stood there for a long time, his hands folded, his head bowed. I watched him, watched for any sign that he noticed something was off, but he just stood there silent, and then he reached out and placed his hand on the woman's folded hands. That's when everything went wrong. The moment his hand made contact, the body jerked. Not a small movement, not a settling, a full, violent spasm, like an electrical current had just run through it. The hands clenched. The shoulders lifted. The head snapped to the right. The pastor stumbled backward, his face pale, his mouth open in shock. The family saw it. Everyone saw it. The room went silent. Dead silent. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful. It's the silence of held breath, of minds trying to process something that doesn't make sense. I moved fast, faster than I've moved in years. I was at the casket in 3 steps, my hands on the edge, my body blocking the view. "It's all right," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Just a shift in the platform, completely normal. It wasn't normal. Nothing about it was normal. But I needed to control the narrative. Needed to give them something to hold on to that wasn't terror. The assistant was already moving, positioning himself on the other side of the casket, helping me stabilize it. Together, we lifted the casket slightly, just enough to check the platform underneath. The pins were still in place. The platform wasn't tilted. There was no mechanical explanation for what had just happened. But I couldn't say that. I couldn't tell a room full of grieving people that their mother, their grandmother, their friend, had just moved on her own. So I lied. The locking mechanism shifted. We'll have it secured in just a moment. The family stayed back, watching, uncertain. The pastor was still pale, his hand pressed to his chest. I could see his fingers shaking. We repositioned the body. It took both of us. The woman's hands had clenched so tightly that I had to pry the fingers open, one by one, and even then they felt resistant, like she didn't want to let go. Her head had turned so far to the right that the neck looked wrong, the angle too sharp. I rotated it back, slowly, feeling the resistance in the tissue, and when it finally settled into place, I heard a faint sound. Not a crack, not a pop. Something quieter, like air escaping from a long sealed space. The assistant heard it too. I could tell by the way his hands froze for a second before he continued adjusting the dress. We worked in silence, quickly, efficiently, repositioned the hands, smoothed the fabric, checked the face. When we were done, she looked peaceful again, exactly as she had at the start of the viewing. I stepped back, nodded to the assistant, and turned to face the family. "Everything's secure now," I said. "I apologize for the disruption. Sometimes the mechanisms we use to support the casket can settle during a viewing, especially with temperature changes in the room. It's nothing to worry about." The son stood up slowly. He looked at me, then at the casket, then back at me. She moved. I met his eyes, kept my voice calm. The platform shifted. It can create the appearance of movement. I assure you, everything is stable now. He didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. People don't, usually. They want to believe you. They need to believe you. Because the alternative is too frightening. He sat back down, and slowly, hesitantly, people began to approach the casket again. But the energy in the room had changed. The grief was still there, but now it was laced with unease, with doubt. I could feel it in the way people moved, the way they glanced at each other. The viewing continued, but it was different now, subdued, careful. I stayed close to the casket for the rest of the service. Didn't move from my position. Didn't take my eyes off the body. The vibration in the platform was still there, faint but persistent. And every few minutes I'd see a small shift, a finger twitching. The fabric of her dress moving slightly, like something underneath was breathing. But nothing as dramatic as before, nothing that would cause another panic. At 4:30, the viewing ended. The family filed out slowly, reluctantly, the way families always do. The son was the last to leave. He stood at the door for a long moment, looking back at the casket, and then he turned to me. "You'll take care of her?" I nodded, of course. When the room was finally empty, I locked the door. The assistant and I stood on either side of the casket, looking down at the woman's face. She looked peaceful, still. Exactly as a body should look. But I could still feel the vibration in the platform, faint and steady like a heartbeat that refused to stop. "What do we do?" the assistant asked. I didn't answer right away, just stood there thinking. We had a burial scheduled for the next morning. The family would be back at 9. We couldn't cancel, couldn't delay, couldn't give them any reason to think something was wrong. So we did what we always do. We followed the procedure. We checked the body one more time, repositioned the hands, made sure the face was centered, smoothed the fabric, and then we closed the casket, locked it, sealed it. The vibration stopped the moment the lid clicked into place. I don't know what caused it. I've gone over every detail 100 times. The platform was stable. The temperature was controlled. The body was properly prepared. There's no medical explanation for what happened. No mechanical failure. No environmental factor. But I also know what I saw. What we both saw. And I know that when I go back into that chapel tomorrow morning, I'll check the casket one more time before the family arrives. I'll make sure the locks are secure. I'll make sure nothing has shifted. And I'll stand there during the burial, watching, waiting, hoping that whatever was vibrating under that platform stays buried when we lower her into the ground. Because some things don't have explanations. Some things you just have to seal shut and walk away from. That's what I learned last Thursday, and that's what I'll remember the next time a family asks me if their loved one looks peaceful. My name is Alaric Varnado, and I've been an embalmer for 22 years. I work the night shift because that's when most bodies arrive, and because I prefer the silence. During the day, this place is full of voices. Families crying, phones ringing, salespeople trying to upsell caskets. At night, it's just me and the preparation room and whatever comes through the door. That's how I like it. Clean, quiet, controlled. You learn things in the silence that you'd never notice in the noise. You learn how a body settles on the table, how the skin changes color under fluorescent light, how the small muscles in the face hold tension even after death, and how that tension releases in stages like layers of an onion peeling away. You learn to read a body the way some people read books. Every mark tells a story. Every bruise, every scar, every broken capillary. My job is to erase those stories, or at least soften them enough that the family can say goodbye without flinching. The body that came in last Tuesday arrived just after midnight. Male, mid-50s, found in his apartment after a neighbor complained about the smell. The report said he'd been dead for approximately 4 days before discovery. No signs of trauma. No evidence of foul play. Probable cause of death was cardiac arrest, pending autopsy results. When I unzipped the body bag, the smell hit me immediately. Not overwhelming, but present, sweet and sour at the same time, with an undertone of copper. It's a smell you never get used to, no matter how many years you've been doing this. You just learn to breathe through it. I transferred the body to the preparation table, working carefully to avoid disturbing any evidence the medical examiner might need later. The skin had already begun to discolor, greenish-brown patches along the abdomen where decomposition had started. Lividity settled into the back and shoulders where blood had pooled after the heart stopped. His eyes were half open, clouded, staring at nothing. Mouth slightly ajar, hands curled inward, fingers stiff. I started with the checklist. Weight, height, identifying marks. He had a tattoo on his left shoulder, an anchor with a banner underneath, the kind sailors used to get. There was a surgical scar on his abdomen, maybe 10 years old, fully healed. No other distinguishing features. I photographed everything, noted it in the file, and then I began the cleaning process. Soap, water, gentle pressure. I washed his face first, using a soft cloth to remove the residue that had built up around his eyes and mouth. The skin was cool, but not cold. Room temperature, which meant he'd been in the bag long enough for the chill of the morgue to fade. That's normal. Bodies equilibrate. They match whatever environment they're in. I worked methodically, section by section, washing away the traces of death and decay, preparing the surface for what came next. When I finished cleaning, I stepped back and looked at him, really looked. This is the part most people don't understand. Before you start the embalming process, you have to see the person, not the body, not the corpse. The person. You have to imagine them alive, moving, talking. You have to picture the way their face looked when they smiled, the way their hands gestured when they spoke, because that's what you're trying to recreate. Not life exactly, but the memory of it, the shape of it. I studied his face, the lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw. He'd been a smoker. I could tell by the yellowing around his fingernails and the texture of his lips. Probably drank, too, judging by the broken capillaries across his nose. But he'd also smiled a lot. You can see that in the creases around the mouth, the way the skin folds. He'd been someone who laughed. Someone who found joy, even in a hard life. That's what I needed to remember when I positioned his face for the viewing. I began the embalming process at 12:45. Standard procedure. Incision along the right clavicle, exposure of the carotid artery and jugular vein, insertion of the arterial tube. I work with a gravity feed machine, old-fashioned but reliable. The formaldehyde mixture flows slowly, steadily, pushing out the blood and replacing it with preservative. You have to monitor the pressure carefully. Too much, and you risk swelling. Too little, and you don't get full distribution. I've done this so many times, I can feel when it's right, when the fluid is moving through the body the way it should. I started the flow and stepped back, watching the tube, watching the body, waiting for the first signs of distribution. The skin should firm up slightly. The discoloration should begin to fade. The features should settle into a more natural position, but nothing happened. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The fluid was flowing. I could see it moving through the tube, could hear the faint gurgle of the machine, but the body wasn't responding. The skin stayed slack. The color didn't change. I checked the tube, made sure it was properly seated in the artery. It was. I checked the machine, verified the pressure. Normal, everything was exactly as it should be. But the body wasn't taking the fluid. I've seen this before, occasionally. Sometimes, if a body has been dead for too long, the circulatory system breaks down. The vessels collapse, the valves fail, and the fluid can't distribute properly. But this body hadn't been dead that long. 4 days isn't enough to cause that kind of degradation, not in a climate-controlled environment. I adjusted the angle of the table, elevating the head slightly to encourage flow. Still nothing. I turned off the machine and examined the incision site. No leakage. No signs of blockage. The artery was intact. The tube was in place. Everything looked correct. But the body was rejecting the embalming fluid. Or not rejecting it exactly, just not accepting it. Like the veins had closed themselves off, sealed shut against intrusion. I've been doing this long enough to know when something isn't right. This wasn't right. I removed the arterial tube and sutured the incision closed. I'd have to try a different approach. Multiple injection sites, smaller amounts of fluid, slower distribution. It would take longer, but it was the only option. I made a second incision along the left femoral artery, inserted a new tube, and started the flow again. This time, I watched more carefully, my hand on the body's leg, feeling for the subtle changes that indicate distribution, and that's when I felt it. A twitch. Small, almost imperceptible. Just a flicker of movement in the quadriceps, like a muscle contracting and releasing. I stopped the machine immediately, pulled my hand back, stared at the leg. It was still, completely still. No movement, no tension, nothing. I waited, counting seconds in my head. 10, 20, 30. Nothing. I was imagining things, had to be. Muscle twitches aren't uncommon in the early stages of preparation. Residual nerve activity, pockets of ATP still firing in the cells. It's a known phenomenon, well documented, nothing to worry about. I restarted the machine, placed my hand back on the leg. The twitch came again, stronger this time. Definitely a contraction. Definitely movement. I could feel it under my palm, the muscle bunching and then releasing. But the movement wasn't random. It was rhythmic, pulse-like. Like something inside the leg was trying to push the fluid back out. I shut down the machine, removed the tube, and sutured the second incision. My hands were steady, but my mind was racing. This wasn't normal. This wasn't explainable. I've embalmed over 3,000 bodies in my career, and I've never felt anything like that. Never felt a body resist the process with that kind of deliberate, coordinated movement. I stepped back from the table and took a breath. The room was cold. I keep it at 55 degrees during prep to slow decomposition, but I could feel sweat on my forehead. I wiped it away, adjusted my gloves, and looked at the body. It was still, silent. The chest didn't rise, the fingers didn't move. It was a corpse, nothing more. A biological machine that had stopped running. I decided to try cavity embalming. Sometimes, if the arterial method doesn't work, you can preserve the internal organs directly by injecting formaldehyde into the abdominal and thoracic cavities. It's more invasive, but effective. I positioned the trocar, a long, hollow needle designed for this purpose, and inserted it just above the navel, angling it upward toward the diaphragm. The resistance was normal. Tissue, muscle, the usual layers. I pushed it deeper, feeling for the point where it would penetrate the stomach, and then I activated the suction. Dark fluid began to flow through the tube, bile, partially digested food, other organic matter. Standard. I emptied the cavity, then switched to injection mode and began filling it with preservative. The fluid flowed smoothly, no blockages, no complications. I moved the trocar to different positions, making sure to reach all the major organs, lungs, liver, intestines. Everything seemed to be going normally, and then the body sat up. Not slowly, not gradually. It sat up fast, like someone had jerked it upright with a rope. The trocar was still inside the abdomen, still connected to the machine. and when the body moved, the tube pulled taut and then snapped free. Formaldehyde sprayed across the table, across my apron, across the floor. I stumbled backward, hit the counter behind me, knocked over a tray of instruments. The sound was deafening in the silence. Metal clattering on tile, glass breaking, my own breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The body was sitting upright on the table, arms hanging at its sides, head tilted forward, chin resting on its chest. I stared at it, my heart hammering, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. Bodies don't sit up. Not on their own. Not without assistance. It's physically impossible. The muscles are dead. The nervous system is offline. There's no mechanism for voluntary movement. But I was looking right at it. A body sitting upright, completely still. I took a step forward, then another. My hands were shaking, but I forced them steady. I needed to understand what had happened. Needed to find the rational explanation. Maybe I'd bumped the table. Maybe the angle had shifted and gravity had pulled the torso upward. Maybe rigor mortis was releasing in a way that created temporary tension in the muscles. I reached out slowly, carefully, and placed my hand on the body's shoulder. The skin was cool, firm, exactly as it should be. I applied gentle pressure, trying to ease the body back down into a supine position. It didn't move. I pushed harder, still nothing. It was like the body had locked itself upright, every muscle engaged, holding the position against my efforts. I braced myself and pushed with both hands using my full weight. And then, suddenly, the resistance vanished. The body collapsed backward onto the table, arms flopping to the sides, head rolling to the left. The movement was so abrupt I almost fell forward on top of it. I stepped back, breathing hard. The room felt smaller than it had a few minutes ago. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed too bright, the shadows too dark. I looked at the body, at the face. The eyes were still half open, clouded, unseeing. The mouth was still slightly ajar. Nothing had changed. Nothing was different. Except that I'd just watched a dead man sit up on my table, and I had no explanation for it. I checked the angle of the table, level. I checked the locks on the wheels. Secure. I checked the floor for any unevenness that might have caused a shift. Nothing. The table was stable. The body was stable. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the fact that it had just moved on its own. I glanced at the clock. 1:37 in the morning. I still had hours of work ahead of me. The body needed to be fully embalmed, dressed, and prepared for viewing by 8 a.m. The family was coming at 9. I couldn't leave it half-finished, couldn't walk away. This was my job, my responsibility. I took a deep breath, pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, and returned to the table. I repositioned the body, made sure the limbs were straight, the head centered. I cleaned up the spilled formaldehyde, reset the instruments, and prepared to continue. But this time, I worked differently. I didn't use the machine. I didn't try to force fluid through the circulatory system. Instead, I used a syringe, manual injection, small amounts at a time, directly into the tissue. It's slower, more tedious, but it gives you more control. I started with the face, injecting formaldehyde into the muscles around the eyes, the cheeks, the jaw. The skin firmed up almost immediately, taking on a more lifelike texture. I moved to the neck, the shoulders, the arms. Slow, methodical, one injection at a time. The body didn't move, didn't resist. It just lay there, accepting the fluid, the way it was supposed to. I worked for 2 hours, injecting, massaging, checking for even distribution. By 3:45, the preservation was complete. The skin had a healthy firmness, the discoloration had faded, the features had settled into a peaceful expression. I dressed the body in the clothes the family had provided: a dark suit, white shirt, blue tie. I combed the hair, applied a light layer of foundation to even out the skin tone, and positioned the hands in a natural resting position. When I was finished, I stepped back and looked at the work. It was good, clean, professional, exactly what the family had requested. The man on the table looked like he was sleeping, calm, at peace. You'd never know he'd been dead for 4 days. You'd never know he'd sat up in the middle of the preparation process. I covered the body with a sheet and wheeled the table into the refrigeration unit. The temperature inside was just above freezing, cold enough to slow any further decomposition, but not so cold that it would damage the tissue. I locked the door, checked the seals, and walked back to the preparation room. The floor was still wet from the spilled formaldehyde. I mopped it up, sanitized the table, put away the instruments. By the time I finished cleaning, it was nearly 5 in the morning. The sun would be up soon. The day shift would arrive. Families would come for viewings. Life would continue, the way it always does, unaware of what happens in the quiet hours when the dead are prepared for burial. I sat down at the desk in the corner of the room and filled out the preparation report. Cause of death, pending. Condition of body, moderate decomposition. Embalming method, manual tissue injection due to circulatory collapse. There was a section at the bottom for notes for anything unusual that occurred during the process. I stared at it for a long time, pen in hand, trying to decide what to write. In the end, I left it blank. What was I supposed to say? That the body sat up, that it resisted the fluid, that I felt something inside it pushing back, something that didn't want to be preserved. No one would believe me, and even if they did, what difference would it make? The body was prepared. The family would have their viewing. The man would be buried. That's all that mattered. But I keep thinking about it, about the way the body moved, about the rhythm of the twitches in the leg, the deliberate resistance, the sudden collapse. I keep thinking about the moment it sat up, the way it held itself upright like it was trying to stand, like it was trying to leave. I've read the literature. I know about cadaveric spasm, about rigor mortis, about the release of gases that can cause movement in a corpse. I know all the scientific explanations, but I also know what I felt. And what I felt wasn't random. It wasn't chemical. It was purposeful, like the body didn't want to be embalmed, like it was fighting to stay. Not alive, but unpreserved, unfixed, free to continue the process of decay. I don't know why that would be. I don't know what difference it makes to a dead man, whether his body is embalmed or left to rot. But I've been thinking about it all week, turning it over in my mind, trying to make sense of it. And the more I think about it, the more I realize I don't have an answer. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe some things just happen, and you have to accept them and move on. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to move on. But every time I walk into the preparation room, every time I unzip a body bag and see a face staring up at me with clouded eyes, I wonder if it's going to happen again. If I'm going to feel that twitch, that resistance, that deliberate pushback against the work I'm trying to do. The family came at 9, just like they were supposed to. They viewed the body, cried, said their goodbyes. They told me I'd done a beautiful job, that he looked so peaceful, so much like himself. They thanked me, shook my hand, and then they left, and I was alone again, standing in the empty viewing room, looking at the casket. I wanted to open it, wanted to check one more time, to make sure the body was still lying flat, still positioned correctly. But I didn't. I just stood there, listening to the silence, feeling the cold air from the vents, and then I walked away. I locked the doors, turned off the lights, and went home. I didn't sleep. I haven't been sleeping well this week. Every time I close my eyes, I see that body sitting up. I see the way it moved, fast and sudden, like it had been waiting for the right moment, like it had been holding still on purpose and then decided it didn't need to anymore. I know it's not rational. I know there's a logical explanation for what happened. Gas buildup in the abdominal cavity, muscle contractions caused by the trocar, a shift in the table that I didn't notice. Something, anything. But the rational part of my brain keeps getting drowned out by the part that was there, that felt it, that watched it happen. That part knows what it saw. And it's not letting go. I'm supposed to work again tonight. Another body came in this afternoon, and it's waiting for me in the refrigeration unit. I'll do the same thing I always do. I'll clean it, prepare it, embalm it. I'll follow the procedure step by step, exactly as I've been trained. And I'll try not to think about what happened last Tuesday. I'll try not to wonder if the body on my table tonight is going to sit up, if it's going to resist the fluid, if it's going to push back. But I'll be ready, just in case. I've started keeping a second syringe on the table, filled and capped, within easy reach. I've started working faster, more efficiently, minimizing the time between incision and preservation. And I've started talking to them. Not prayers, not ceremonies. Just simple acknowledgement. A quiet greeting when I first open the body bag. A few words while I work, letting them know what I'm doing, why I'm doing it. It's something I never used to do. I always believed in silence, in professionalism, in keeping the boundary clear between the living and the dead. But maybe that boundary isn't as clear as I thought. Maybe the dead can hear us. Maybe they understand, on some level, that we're trying to help, that we're not the enemy, that all we want is to give them a little more time. A few more days of looking whole, of being recognized, before the earth takes them back. I don't know if it makes a difference, but I'm going to keep doing it, because the alternative, the silence, the cold efficiency, the assumption that a body is just a thing to be processed, that doesn't feel right anymore. Not after what I saw, not after what I felt. So I'll talk to them. I'll tell them their name. I'll tell them they're safe. And I'll hope that whatever part of them is still listening, still present, still clinging to the edges of this world, I'll hope that it hears me, and that it lets go. My name is Leland Fosdick, and I run the crematory at Hillcrest Memorial Services. It's a small operation, just me and one assistant who comes in 3 days a week to help with maintenance and paperwork. Most of the time, though, it's just me and the retort, which is what we call the cremation chamber. Some people call it an oven, but that's not quite right. An oven cooks, a retort reduces. It takes a human body, bones, tissue, organs, everything that makes a person physical, and turns it into approximately 5 pounds of ash and bone fragments. It's a clean process, efficient, respectful, and it's governed by very strict regulations because people need to know that when they entrust us with their loved ones' remains, they're getting back exactly what they're supposed to. No mixing, no contamination. One body, one chamber, one container. That's the rule. The retort itself is a steel-lined chamber about 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, with a heavy door that seals tight to contain the heat. Inside, the temperature can reach 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to vaporize soft tissue and calcify bone. The process takes between 2 and 4 hours, depending on the size of the body and the density of the skeletal structure. Larger bodies take longer. Bodies with joint replacements or surgical implants require additional processing afterward, because metal doesn't burn. It just melts and has to be separated from the remains. I've been doing this for 16 years, and I've cremated over 4,000 people. I know the sounds, the smells, the way the temperature fluctuates during different stages of the process. I know when something is normal and when it's not. and I know that what happened last Wednesday was not normal. The body came in Tuesday evening. Female, late 60s, died of natural causes at a hospice facility. The family had requested cremation with a short viewing beforehand, just immediate family, no service. We'd arranged for them to come at 10 a.m. Wednesday morning for a final goodbye before the cremation. The body had been prepared by our funeral director, minimal cosmetic work, just enough to make her look peaceful. She was dressed in a simple white gown, hands folded, positioned on a cardboard tray inside a rental casket. We use rental caskets for this kind of viewing because the family doesn't pay for a full burial casket when the body is going to be cremated. The rental has a removable insert, the cardboard tray, that slides out after the viewing and goes directly into the retort. It's cost-effective and serves the same purpose. The family arrived right on time. There were 5 of them, 2 daughters, a son, and 2 grandchildren. They gathered around the casket in the small viewing room we keep adjacent to the crematory. I stood near the door, hands clasped, giving them space. They were quiet, respectful. One of the daughters cried softly. The son stood with his arm around her, staring down at his mother's face. The grandchildren, both teenagers, looked uncomfortable, the way young people often do when confronted with death. They didn't stay long. Maybe 15 minutes. The son said a few words, something about how she'd been a good mother, how she'd taught them to be strong. And then they stepped back, nodded to me, and I knew it was time. I wheeled the casket into the adjacent room where the retort was located. There's a large window between the 2 rooms, made of heat-resistant glass, so families can witness the beginning of the cremation if they choose. Some do, some don't. This family chose to stay. I opened the rental casket, confirmed the identification tag on the body, her name, date of birth, date of death, case number. Everything matched the paperwork. I slid the cardboard tray out of the casket and positioned it on the loading table next to the retort. The retort door was already open, preheated to operating temperature. I could feel the heat from where I was standing, a dry, intense warmth that made the air shimmer. I glanced back at the family through the window. They were watching. I gave them a small, respectful nod, and then I activated the loading mechanism. The table is motorized, designed to slide the tray smoothly into the chamber without requiring me to lift or push. It's a matter of dignity as much as safety. You don't shove a body into a cremation chamber, you guide it. With care, the tray began to move. Slowly, steadily, the body slid toward the retort opening. I watched the process, making sure the tray stayed centered, making sure nothing caught or tilted. The family watched too. I could see their reflections in the glass, their faces pale and still. The tray entered the chamber. 6 inches. 12. 2 feet. And then it stopped. Just stopped, halfway in, like the mechanism had hit an obstruction. I frowned, checked the control panel. The motor was still running. No error codes, no mechanical failure indicated. But the tray wasn't moving. I stopped the motor, waited a few seconds, then restarted it. The tray jerked forward an inch, then stopped again. I could hear the motor straining, a low whine that meant it was trying to push against resistance. I shut down the motor and walked around to the side of the retort looking for the problem. Sometimes a corner of the cardboard tray will catch on the chamber edge, or a fold in the gown will snag on something. But I couldn't see anything wrong. The tray was aligned correctly. The chamber was clear. There was no visible obstruction. I returned to the control panel and tried again. This time the tray didn't move at all. The motor engaged, I could hear it running, but the tray stayed locked in place. I glanced back at the family. They were still watching, their expressions shifting from grief to confusion. I gave them what I hoped was a reassuring smile and held up one finger. Just a moment. Technical difficulty. nothing to worry about. Then I shut down the system and approached the retort manually. The heat was intense this close. I could feel it on my face, my hands, even through my protective gear. I reached into the chamber carefully, trying to get a grip on the edge of the tray so I could pull it back out and check for issues. My fingers brushed the cardboard, and that's when I felt it. Movement. Not the tray shifting under my touch, not vibration from the motor. Movement from the body itself. A ripple, subtle but unmistakable, running along the torso. I yanked my hand back, my pulse spiking. I stood there for a moment, breathing hard, telling myself I'd imagined it. Heat does strange things. It warps perception, makes you see movement where there isn't any. I wiped sweat from my forehead and reached in again, this time gripping the tray more firmly. And again I felt it, a contraction, like a muscle tensing and releasing. But that's impossible. The body had been dead for over 48 hours. It had been refrigerated, embalmed, prepared. There's no muscular activity left at that stage. No nerve function, no biological processes that could cause movement. I pulled the tray out of the retort. It came easily this time, no resistance, sliding smoothly back onto the loading table. I looked down at the body. She looked exactly as she had before. Peaceful, still. Hands folded, eyes closed, face relaxed. Nothing had changed. Nothing was different. I checked the gown, looking for any signs that it had snagged or bunched up during the loading process. It was smooth, undisturbed. I checked the tray itself, looking for warping or damage from the heat. It was fine, intact. I stood there, staring down at her, trying to make sense of what I'd felt. And then I noticed her hands. The position had changed. Not a lot, just slightly. The left hand, which had been resting on top of the right, was now beside it, palm down. Fingers spread, like she'd moved it herself. I looked up at the window. The family was still there, watching me with growing concern. I could see the son leaning forward, his hand pressed against the glass. I needed to finish this, needed to get the body into the retort and complete the cremation. I couldn't leave them standing there, wondering what was wrong, doubting whether I knew what I was doing. I repositioned the hands, folding them back into place, and then I activated the loading mechanism again. The tray began to move. Smooth, steady. No resistance. It slid into the retort chamber without issue, disappearing into the heat, and when it was fully inside, I closed the door. The heavy steel panel swung shut with a solid clunk, and I engaged the locking mechanism. Sealed, secure. I turned to the family, gave them a nod, and then I activated the cremation cycle. The retort roared to life. You can hear it through the walls, a deep, steady rumble as the burners ignite and the temperature inside the chamber climbs. I monitor the process on a digital display panel. Temperature, oxygen levels, time elapsed. Everything is tracked, recorded, documented. The family stayed for the first few minutes, watching through the window as the chamber glowed brighter, the heat building. And then, quietly, they left. I heard the outer door close, heard their footsteps fading down the hallway. And then it was just me and the retort. I pulled up a chair and sat down in front of the control panel, the way I always do. The process takes hours, and I don't leave the building while it's running. It's a matter of protocol, but also respect. Someone should be present. Someone should bear witness. 30 minutes into the cycle, I heard the first sound. It was faint, almost inaudible under the roar of the burners, a tapping, rhythmic, like knuckles rapping on glass. I stood up, walked to the observation window on the retort door and looked inside. The chamber was glowing orange-white, the heat so intense that the air inside looked liquid. I could see the outline of the tray, the shape of the body, but details were lost in the brightness. The tapping continued. Steady. Persistent. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to locate the source. It wasn't coming from inside the chamber. It was coming from somewhere else. Somewhere in the walls, maybe, or the ventilation system. Expansion and contraction from the heat, that's all it was. Metal expanding, joints settling, normal sounds. But it didn't sound normal, it sounded deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I walked around the retort, checking the exterior panels, the exhaust vents, the gas lines. Everything looked fine, secure, no loose parts, no signs of malfunction. The tapping stopped. I returned to the control panel and checked the readout. Temperature was holding steady at 1700 degrees. Oxygen flow was normal. Time elapsed, 42 minutes. I sat back down and tried to focus on the paperwork. Intake forms, permits, cremation authorization signed by the next of kin. But I kept glancing at the chamber, kept listening for that sound. It didn't come back, not for a while. An hour into the cycle, the temperature spiked. Not gradually, suddenly. The readout jumped from 1700 to 1900 in less than a minute. I stood up, alarmed, and checked the burner controls. They were set correctly. No malfunction indicated. But the temperature kept climbing. 1950, 2000, 2100. The chamber wasn't designed to go that high. At those temperatures, the steel lining could warp. The refractory bricks could crack. I could damage the entire system. I shut down the burners manually, cutting off the gas flow. The temperature should have started dropping immediately, but it didn't. It held steady at 2100, like something inside the chamber was generating its own heat. I grabbed the emergency shutdown lever and pulled it. The entire system powered down. Burners, ventilation, digital displays. Everything went dark except for the glow from inside the chamber, visible through the observation window. That glow should have started fading as soon as I cut the power. But it didn't. It stayed bright, steady, and then it started to pulse. Slow, rhythmic pulses, like a heartbeat. Bright, dim, bright, dim. I backed away from the retort, my hands shaking. This wasn't mechanical. This wasn't a malfunction. This was something else. I grabbed my phone, ready to call for help, and that's when I heard it again. The tapping. Louder this time. Faster, coming from inside the chamber. I approached the observation window slowly, every instinct telling me to get out of the building, to leave and not come back. But I couldn't. There was a body in that chamber. A person who had been entrusted to my care. I had a responsibility. I looked through the window, squinting against the brightness, and I saw movement. Inside the chamber, the body was moving. Not twitching, not spasming, moving. The arms were no longer folded across the chest. They were extended, reaching upward, hands pressed against the inside of the door. The fingers were spread wide, flat against the steel, and they were tapping. That was the sound I'd been hearing. The body, inside the chamber, knocking on the door. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't possible. At those temperatures, soft tissue vaporizes, muscles burn away, tendons snap. There's nothing left to move, nothing left to contract. But I was watching it happen, watching the hands press against the door, watching the fingers curl and extend. And then the body sat up. It sat up inside the cremation chamber, in the middle of a 2,000-degree inferno, and it turned its head toward the observation window. Toward me. The face was gone. Burned away. Just bone and char and the faint glow of heat radiating from the skull. But it was looking at me. I could feel it. I could feel the weight of that eyeless stare, pinning me in place. I ran. I don't remember making the decision. I just ran. Out of the crematory, down the hallway, through the building, out into the parking lot. I stood there in the cold morning air, shaking, gasping, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. I looked back at the building. Smoke was rising from the chimney, thick, black smoke, more than there should be. I pulled out my phone and called the fire department. Told them there was a malfunction at the crematory, possible fire hazard, need immediate assistance. They arrived 12 minutes later. By then, the smoke had stopped. The building was quiet. No flames. No visible damage. The fire chief and I went inside together. The crematory room was exactly as I'd left it. Retort door closed, control panel dark, emergency shutdown still engaged. The chief checked the chamber, examined the burners, inspected the ventilation system. Everything was intact. No signs of overheating, no damage. He looked at me with a mixture of concern and suspicion. "You said there was a fire." I nodded, tried to explain. The temperature spike, the smoke, the sounds. He listened, his expression neutral, and then he asked if I'd been working alone. I said yes. He suggested I might have been experiencing heat exhaustion, stress, fatigue. Suggested I take a break. Maybe see a doctor. I didn't argue. I just thanked him and waited for him to leave. When I was alone again, I stood in front of the retort staring at the door. I didn't want to open it. Didn't want to see what was inside. But I had to. I had to know. I disengaged the emergency shutdown, powered up the system, and let the chamber cool for 2 hours. When the temperature dropped below 200 degrees, I unlocked the door and pulled it open. Inside, on the tray, were the remains. Ash. Bone fragments. Exactly what should be there after a cremation. No body, no hands pressed against the door, no skull turned toward me. Just the clean, white remnants of a human skeleton, reduced to its most basic components. I processed the remains the way I always do. Removed the tray, transferred the ash and bone to the cremulator for final grinding, poured the processed remains into a temporary container. Everything was normal, routine, but I can't stop thinking about what I saw, what I felt, the way the temperature spiked, the way the hands moved, the way the body sat up and turned toward me. I've gone over it 1,000 times, looking for a rational explanation. Heat-induced muscle contractions, gases expanding inside the body, creating the illusion of movement. Stress-related hallucinations brought on by fatigue and isolation. Any of those things could explain what happened. All of them together could explain it. But none of them feel right, because I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't random, it wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. Like the body didn't want to burn, like it was trying to get out. I've worked in cremation for 16 years, and I've never believed in anything beyond the physical. I've always trusted the process, trusted the science. Fire consumes, flesh burns, bone crumbles. That's the natural order. That's how it works. But what if it doesn't always work that way? What if sometimes, for reasons we don't understand, a body resists? What if the part of us that makes us human, the part that thinks and feels and remembers, doesn't let go as easily as we think? What if it clings to the body, even as the body burns, trying desperately to hold on to the only physical form it's ever known? I don't have answers. I don't think anyone does. But I've changed the way I work. I've started talking to them the way some of my colleagues do. Before I load a body into the retort, I stand there for a moment and I speak. I tell them it's going to be all right. I tell them the fire is quick, that it doesn't hurt, that when it's over, they'll be free. I don't know if they hear me. I don't know if it makes a difference, but I say it anyway. Because maybe, on some level, they need to hear it. Maybe they need to know that someone is there, that someone is paying attention, that they're not being thrown into the fire and forgotten. The family came back the next day to collect the ashes. I met them in the lobby, handed them the urn, expressed my condolences. They thanked me, told me I'd done a respectful job, that they appreciated the care I'd taken. And then they left, and I was alone again. I went back to the crematory and stood in front of the retort. The chamber was cold now, silent. I opened the door and looked inside. Empty. Clean. Ready for the next body. I closed the door, locked it, and walked away. But I still hear it sometimes. Late at night, when the building is empty and the retort is cold, I hear that tapping. Faint. Rhythmic. Like knuckles on glass. And I wonder if I'm imagining it. Or if somewhere in the walls or the vents or the space between the steel and the brick, something is still trying to get out. My name is Orson Taggart, and I've been a mortuary transport technician for 11 years. Most people don't know this job exists until they need it. When someone dies in a hospital, a nursing home, or at a private residence, someone has to move the body from that location to the funeral home. That someone is me. I drive a specially equipped van with a hydraulic lift and a secure cargo area designed to hold a gurney. The gurney has straps, 4 of them, positioned across the chest, hips, thighs, and ankles to keep the body stable during transport. It's not about restraint, it's about safety. A body that shifts during transit can slide off the gurney, and that's a situation no one wants to deal with. The straps are there to prevent movement, that's all. That's their only purpose. I work mostly at night. Deaths don't follow a schedule, and families don't want to wait until morning for their loved one to be picked up. So I'm on call from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m., 7 days a week. Some nights I don't get a single call. Other nights I make 4 or 5 trips. It depends. I've transported bodies from hospital morgues, from homes where the deceased had been under hospice care, from accident scenes where the coroner had already released the remains. I've seen every kind of death you can imagine. Peaceful, violent, expected, sudden. After a while, you stop being surprised. You just do the job. You move the body, fill out the paperwork, deliver it to the funeral home, and move on to the next call. Last Friday night, I got a call at 11:15. Single vehicle accident on Route 9, about 40 miles north of the city. The driver had lost control on a curve and hit a tree. No other vehicles involved. The coroner had been on scene, declared the driver dead, and released the body for transport. The caller, a deputy at the county sheriff's office, gave me the coordinates and told me to meet the tow truck driver at the site. They'd already removed the body from the vehicle and had it waiting on a tarp beside the road. I loaded my gear into the van: gurney, straps, body bag, gloves, disinfectant, paperwork, and headed north. The roads were empty at that hour, just me and the occasional long-haul truck. It was a clear night, cold, the kind of cold that makes your breath fog even inside the van. I had the heater running, the radio playing low, and I was making good time. I reached the accident site just before midnight. The tow truck was still there, its flashing amber lights cutting through the darkness. The driver waved me over, and I pulled onto the shoulder behind him. The wrecked car was already hooked up, the front end crumpled, windshield shattered. There was a smear of blood on the steering wheel, visible even from a distance. I grabbed my gear and walked over to where the body was lying. The tow truck driver was standing a few feet away, smoking a cigarette, looking uncomfortable. He didn't say anything, just pointed at the tarp and then looked away. I've seen that reaction before. Some people can't handle being near the dead. It makes them feel something they don't want to feel. Mortality, maybe, or just the simple fact that we all end up the same way eventually. I knelt beside the body and unfolded the bag. The deceased was male, mid-30s, wearing jeans and a heavy jacket. No visible trauma to the head or limbs, but I could see bruising around the neck and chest, probably from the seatbelt and the impact with the steering wheel. I checked for a pulse, more out of protocol than necessity. Nothing. Skin was cool, beginning to stiffen. He'd been dead for at least an hour, maybe longer. I positioned the body bag alongside him, rolled him carefully onto it, and zipped it shut. Then I signaled to the tow truck driver to help me lift. He hesitated, took one last drag on his cigarette, and then walked over. Together, we lifted the body onto the gurney. It was heavier than it looked. Dead weight is always heavier. Something about the way the muscles relax and the body becomes completely limp. We positioned it carefully, making sure the head was supported, the limbs straight. And then I secured the straps. I always use the same procedure. Chest strap first, pulled snug but not tight. Hip strap next, positioned just above the pelvis. Thigh strap centered. Ankle strap last, to keep the feet from shifting. I double-check each one, making sure the buckles are secure, the straps are flat, no twists or tangles. It's a routine I've done hundreds of times, and I don't deviate from it. Consistency is important in this job. It keeps you from making mistakes. When all 4 straps were in place, I thanked the tow truck driver, loaded the gurney into the van, and secured it to the floor mounts. The van has a locking system that keeps the gurney from sliding during transit, even if I have to brake hard or take a sharp turn. Once everything was locked down, I climbed into the driver's seat, entered the destination into the GPS, and pulled back onto the highway. The funeral home was about 50 miles south, a straight shot down Route 9 and then west on a county road for the last 10 miles. I settled into the drive, keeping the speed steady, the radio low. I don't like silence when I'm transporting. It makes the trip feel longer, makes me too aware of what's in the back of the van. So I keep the radio on. Talk shows, music, whatever's playing. Just background noise to fill the space. I'd been driving for maybe 20 minutes when I felt the first shift. It was subtle, barely noticeable. Just a slight change in the weight distribution of the van, like something in the cargo area had moved. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The gurney was where it should be, locked in place, straps secure. I couldn't see the body itself. The cargo area is separated from the cab by a solid partition, but I could see the edge of the gurney, and it hadn't moved. I adjusted the mirror and kept driving. 5 minutes later, I felt it again. A shift. Heavier this time, enough that the van swayed slightly to the right. I slowed down, checked the mirror again. Nothing. The gurney was stable. I told myself it was the wind. There'd been gusts all night, strong enough to push against the side of the van on open stretches of road. Or maybe the road surface was uneven, causing the suspension to shift. Either explanation made sense. Both were more logical than the alternative. I kept driving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It's a feeling you develop after years of doing this kind of work, a sixth sense for when things aren't quite right. I've learned to trust it. I pulled over at the next rest area, put the van in park, and got out. The cargo area has a side door that opens to give access to the gurney without having to go through the back. I unlocked it and pulled it open. The gurney was exactly where I'd left it, locked into the floor mounts, straps in place. I walked around to the other side, checking the securing mechanisms. Everything was tight, secure. I checked the body bag, zipped shut, no tears, no visible issues. I ran my hand along the straps, feeling for any slack. Nothing. Everything was exactly as it should be. I stood there for a moment, listening to the wind, the distant sound of traffic on the highway, and then I heard something else, a faint sound, almost inaudible, like fabric sliding against fabric. I looked at the body bag. The chest area seemed higher than it had been. Not by much. Just a slight elevation, like the body had taken a breath. But that's impossible. The dead don't breathe. I reached out and pressed my hand against the bag, feeling through the thick vinyl for any change in the body's position. The chest was firm, still, exactly as it should be. No rise and fall, no movement. I was imagining things, fatigue, probably, or the stress of working alone at night on empty highways. I closed the cargo door, locked it, and got back in the driver's seat. I sat there for a minute, collecting myself, and then I pulled back onto the highway. The GPS showed 32 miles to the funeral home. 40 minutes, maybe less if traffic stayed light. I could make it. I accelerated to highway speed and focused on the road. The yellow lines painted on the asphalt, the reflective signs marking the exits, the red taillights of a semi-truck a quarter mile ahead. Anything to keep my mind occupied. Anything to stop thinking about the sound I'd heard, the way the chest had looked elevated, the feeling that something in the cargo area wasn't quite right. 10 miles later, I felt the shift again. This time, it was unmistakable. The entire van lurched to the right, hard enough that I had to correct the steering to keep from drifting into the shoulder. I slowed down, gripping the wheel tighter, my pulse accelerating. In the rearview mirror, I could see the gurney. It had moved. Not a lot, maybe 2 inches to the right, but enough that it was no longer centered between the floor mounts. That shouldn't be possible. The locking mechanism is designed to hold a gurney in place even during a collision. A simple shift in weight shouldn't be enough to move it. I pulled over again, this time onto a wider shoulder with better lighting from a nearby overpass. I killed the engine, grabbed a flashlight from the glove box, and went to the cargo area. When I opened the door, I knew immediately that something was wrong. The gurney had definitely moved. The left wheel was still locked into the floor mount, but the right wheel had come free. The strap system was intact, but the angle of the gurney had changed. It was tilted now, slanting to the right, and the body bag had shifted with it. The bag was no longer lying flat. The upper portion, the head and shoulders, was pressed against the right wall of the cargo area, and the lower portion, the legs and feet, had rotated to the left. It looked like the body inside had rolled, like it had turned onto its side. I set the flashlight on the floor, angled so it illuminated the gurney, and I reached for the straps. I needed to reposition everything, get the gurney locked back into place, straighten the body, secure the straps. Standard procedure for a shift during transport. I loosened the chest strap first, and that's when I saw it. The body bag was moving. Not the whole bag, just the midsection. A slow, rippling motion, like something inside was contracting and expanding. I froze, my hand still on the strap buckle, my breath caught in my throat. I stared at the bag, watching, waiting to see if it would happen again. And it did. The midsection of the bag bulged slightly, then flattened, then bulged again. Rhythmic. Steady. Like breathing. I stepped back, my mind racing through every possible explanation. Gas buildup in the abdomen. That's common in bodies that have been dead for several hours. Gases accumulate in the digestive tract and create pressure, sometimes enough to cause the abdomen to distend. That had to be it. That had to be what I was seeing. Just gases, just biology, just the natural process of decomposition. But the movement didn't stop. It continued, steady and rhythmic, and now I could hear it too. A faint sound, wet and labored, like someone struggling to breathe through fluid-filled lungs. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it directly on the bag. The vinyl was opaque, dark blue, but I could see the outline of the body inside, and I could see the chest rising and falling, over and over. I unzipped the bag. I don't know why I did it. Every instinct told me not to, told me to close the cargo door and drive straight to the funeral home and let someone else deal with it. But I couldn't. I needed to see, needed to know what was happening. I pulled the zipper down slowly, the metallic sound loud in the confined space, and I opened the bag. The body was exactly as I'd positioned it. Arms at the sides, legs straight, head centered. The face was pale, the eyes closed, the mouth slightly open. There was a bruise on the left temple, purple and swollen, probably from the impact. But nothing else. No blood, no visible trauma, no signs of life. The chest was still, completely still. No rise and fall. No movement at all. I stared at it, my hand still gripping the flashlight, my mind trying to reconcile what I'd just seen with what I was seeing now. The movement had stopped the moment I opened the bag, like whatever had been causing it knew I was watching. I reached out slowly and placed my hand on the chest. The body was cold, stiff, dead. I could feel the hardness of rigor mortis setting into the muscles, the way the tissue resisted pressure. There was no heartbeat, no pulse, no breath. I zipped the bag shut, my hands shaking. I needed to get moving, needed to finish this transport and get back to town. I repositioned the gurney, locked both wheels back into the floor mounts, and tightened the straps. This time, I pulled them tighter than usual, tight enough that the body wouldn't shift even if the gurney moved again. I checked everything twice, 3 times, and then I closed the cargo door and got back in the driver's seat. The GPS showed 20 miles to the funeral home, 25 minutes. I could do this. I started the engine, pulled back onto the highway and drove. The rest of the trip was a nightmare. Every minute felt like an hour. Every sound made me flinch. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, checking to see if the gurney had moved, if the straps had come loose, if the body bag was shifting. But everything stayed in place. The van ran smoothly, the road was clear. Nothing happened. And somehow, that made it worse. The silence, the stillness, the feeling that something was waiting, watching. I turned the radio up louder, but it didn't help. I could still hear it in my head, that wet, labored breathing, that rhythmic rise and fall of the chest. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. When I finally pulled into the funeral home's loading bay, I felt a wave of relief so intense it made me dizzy. I parked, shut off the engine, and just sat there for a moment, breathing, letting the adrenaline drain out of my system. The funeral home's night attendant came out to meet me, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a calm demeanor. He helped me unload the gurney, and together we wheeled it into the preparation room. I filled out the paperwork, noted the time of arrival, the condition of the body, the transport details. Everything routine, everything normal. The attendant thanked me, and I walked back to the van. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I stood in the loading bay, staring at the cargo area, and I felt the need to check one more time, to make sure everything was empty, to make sure I hadn't left anything behind. I opened the cargo door and shone my flashlight inside. The gurney was gone. The floor mounts were empty. The straps were coiled neatly on a shelf where I always kept them. Everything was exactly as it should be. Except for one thing. There was a smell. Faint, but unmistakable. Copper and sweetness. The smell of a body that had been dead for hours. I'd smelled it before, countless times, but never like this. Never lingering in the cargo area after the body had been removed. I grabbed the disinfectant spray and cleaned the floor, the walls, the mounts. I wiped down every surface, trying to eliminate the smell, trying to make the cargo area feel clean again. But even after I finished, I could still smell it. Faint, persistent, like it had soaked into the metal and wouldn't let go. I drove home slowly, taking surface streets instead of the highway. I didn't want to go fast. Didn't want to feel the van sway or shift or do anything that might remind me of what had happened on Route 9. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the van for a long time, engine off, hands still on the wheel. I kept replaying the trip in my mind. The shifts, the sounds, the way the body bag had moved, the way the chest had risen and fallen. I kept trying to find a rational explanation, something that made sense, something I could write in a report and have someone nod and say, "Yes, that's normal, that happens sometimes." But I couldn't find it, because nothing about what I'd experienced was normal. I went inside, took a shower, tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that body bag. I saw the midsection bulging and flattening. I heard that wet, labored breathing. I felt the weight shift in the van, the gurney moving, the straps straining. I gave up on sleep around 5 in the morning and made coffee instead. I sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the dark sky, waiting for sunrise. When my phone rang at 6:30, I almost didn't answer. But it was my supervisor calling to check on the transport from the night before. I told him everything went fine. No issues. Body delivered on time, paperwork complete. He thanked me and hung up. I didn't tell him about the shifts. Didn't tell him about the breathing. Didn't tell him about the smell that still seemed to cling to my clothes even after I'd showered and changed. I'm scheduled to work again tonight. There's already a call queued up. A body at a nursing home needs to be transported to a funeral home across town. Simple job, straightforward. I've done it 100 times. But I keep thinking about Route 9, about the way the body moved, about the sound of breathing in the cargo area. About the moment I opened the body bag and everything was still, like nothing had happened at all, like it had all been in my head. Maybe it was. Maybe I was more tired than I realized. Maybe the stress of working alone at night finally caught up with me. Maybe my mind filled in details that weren't there, created sounds and movements out of nothing. That's the explanation I want to believe. That's the one that lets me do my job without questioning everything. But there's a part of me that knows better. A part that remembers the way the gurney moved, even though it was locked down. The way the body bag shifted, even though the straps were secure. The way the chest rose and fell, even though the body was dead. That part of me knows I didn't imagine it. That part knows something happened on Route 9 that shouldn't have happened. Something that doesn't fit into the neat categories of gas buildup and muscle contractions and post-mortem movement. Something that exists in the space between life and death, in the moments when a body is in transit, suspended between where it died and where it will be buried. That in-between space, that's where it happened. That's where I felt it. I don't know if I'll ever transport another body the same way. I don't know if I'll ever be able to drive at night without checking the rearview mirror, without listening for sounds in the cargo area, without wondering if the straps are tight enough. But I'll keep doing the job. Because someone has to. Because the dead need to be moved and families need closure, and the work doesn't stop just because I'm scared. It doesn't stop just because I saw something I can't explain. So, tonight, I'll load my gear into the van. I'll drive to the nursing home. I'll pick up the body, secure the straps, and drive to the funeral home. And I'll try not to think about Route 9. I'll try not to listen for that wet, labored breathing. I'll try not to watch for movement in the body bag. But I'll check the straps twice, maybe 3 times. And I'll keep the radio on, loud, because silence is worse than sound. Silence lets you hear things that shouldn't be there, and I don't want to hear them again. My name is Maudine Ashgrove, and I've been a restorative artist for 17 years. Most people don't know this profession exists. They assume that when someone dies, They just naturally look peaceful and ready for viewing. But that's rarely the case. Death is messy. It distorts. It bruises. It drains color and leaves behind a mask that looks nothing like the person who wore it in life. My job is to restore that person, to bring them back, visually, to a state that allows their family to say goodbye without flinching. I use cosmetics, prosthetics, wax, thread, and sometimes wire to reconstruct what death has taken apart. It's delicate work, precise. It requires an artist's eye and a surgeon's hand. And it requires something else, too, the ability to look at a face that's been shattered or burned or decomposed and see past the damage to the person underneath. The body that came to me last Monday was a challenge from the start. Female, early 40s, automobile accident. The report said she'd been thrown from the vehicle after it rolled multiple times on a rural highway. Massive head trauma, facial fractures. The family wanted an open casket, which meant I had to make her recognizable. They'd provided a photograph, a snapshot from a family gathering, maybe a year old. She was smiling in the picture, her face lit up with genuine happiness. Dark hair pulled back in a loose braid. High cheekbones. A small scar above her left eyebrow, the kind you get from a childhood fall. That scar was important. Families notice details like that. If I erased it in the reconstruction, they'd know. They'd see a stranger in the casket instead of their wife, their mother, their sister. When the body arrived, I spent a long time just looking at her. Not at the damage. That came later. First, I looked at the parts of her that were still intact. Her hands, slender and long-fingered, with nails that had been recently manicured. Her shoulders, which had a light dusting of freckles. The shape of her ears, small and close to her head. I studied these details because they would anchor the reconstruction. They would remind me, as I worked, that this wasn't just a broken body. This was a person. Someone who had laughed and worked and loved. Someone who deserved to be seen one last time as herself. Then I turned my attention to the face. The damage was extensive. The right side of her skull had fractured on impact, and the facial bones had collapsed inward. The cheekbone was shattered. The eye socket was crushed. The jaw was dislocated and hung at an unnatural angle. The skin had torn in multiple places, and there was significant bruising and swelling across the entire right side. The left side was better, mostly intact, with only minor abrasions and some swelling around the eye. That's where I'd start. I'd use the undamaged side as a template and rebuild the right side to match. I began with the skeletal structure. Using a combination of wax and a moldable polymer compound, I reconstructed the cheekbone. I worked slowly, layering the material, shaping it, comparing it constantly to the left side and to the photograph. The goal was symmetry. The human brain is wired to recognize faces, and even small asymmetries trigger a sense that something is wrong. If the cheekbone was too high or too prominent, the family would notice. They might not be able to articulate what was wrong, but they'd feel it. So I worked with precision, measuring, adjusting, smoothing. The compound had a strange texture under my fingers, cold at first, then warming as I shaped it, becoming almost pliable like clay. I could feel the contours taking shape, the curve of the bone emerging from the formless material. When the cheekbone was in place, I moved to the eye socket. This was more complicated. The orbital bone had been crushed, and fragments had been removed during the autopsy. I had to build a new structure from scratch, one that would support a prosthetic eye and hold it at the correct angle. I used a combination of wax and a small armature made from thin wire, creating a framework that mimicked the natural shape of the socket. The wire had to be bent precisely, each curve matching the anatomical structure I'd memorized from years of training. I twisted it carefully, testing the angles, making sure it would sit flush against the remaining bone. Then I packed the wax around it, building up layers, smoothing them with a heated spatula. The smell of warm wax filled the workroom, mixing with the faint chemical scent of embalming fluid that never quite leaves these spaces. When the socket was complete, I embedded a glass prosthetic eye, blue to match her natural color, and secured it in place with adhesive. The eye had a weight to it, solid and cool in my palm before I positioned it. I angled it carefully, making sure it aligned with the left eye, making sure it would look natural when viewed from different positions. The jaw was next. Dislocations are common in traumatic deaths, and they're relatively easy to fix if the bone is intact. But her jaw had fractured in 2 places, and the alignment was off. I had to reset it manually, applying pressure to guide the bone back into position. I placed my hands on either side of her face, my thumbs pressing against the angle of the jaw, and I pushed, gently at first, then with more force. I could feel the bone shifting, grinding slightly as it moved back into alignment. The sound was faint but distinct, a soft crunch, like stepping on gravel. When the jaw was positioned correctly, I wired it shut from the inside, threading thin surgical wire through the bone and pulling it taut. The wire wouldn't be visible once I finished the external work, but it would hold the jaw stable and prevent it from shifting during the viewing. I tied off the wire with small, tight knots, testing the tension, making sure nothing would slip. When the structural work was complete, I stepped back and assessed. The right side of her face now had shape. It had form. The cheekbone rose to match the left. The eye socket held the prosthetic at the correct angle. The jaw was aligned and secure, but it still looked wrong. The skin was torn, the color was off, and the texture was uneven. That's where the real artistry came in. I began with the skin. Using a fine needle and medical-grade thread, I sutured the torn sections, pulling the edges together with tiny, precise stitches. The goal was to make the seams as invisible as possible. I worked under magnification, using a lamp with a bright, focused beam, and I took my time. Each stitch had to be perfect. Each knot had to be secure. The needle slid through the skin with a faint resistance, not like living tissue, which has elasticity, but with a drier, firmer quality. I pulled the thread carefully, watching the torn edges come together, watching the gap close millimeter by millimeter. When the suturing was complete, I applied a base layer of mortuary wax over the seams, smoothing it into the surrounding tissue, blending it until the texture was uniform. The wax was warm from my hands, soft and moldable. I worked it with my fingertips, pressing it into the seams, feathering the edges so there would be no visible line between the wax and the skin. The work required patience. Rush it, and you'd see the seams. Work too slowly, and the wax would cool and harden before you could blend it properly. I'd learned to find the rhythm, the balance between speed and precision. When the wax was in place, I used a heated spatula to smooth the surface, creating a seamless transition from reconstructed tissue to natural skin. Then I started on the color. This is the part most people don't understand. Death drains color from the skin, leaving it pale and gray. Embalming fluid helps, but it doesn't restore the natural tones, the warmth in the cheeks, the faint pink of the lips, the subtle variations in hue that make a face look alive. I mix my own cosmetics, blending foundations and tints to match the individual's skin tone. For her, I used a base with a slight olive undertone, warmed with a touch of peach. I applied it in thin layers, building up the color gradually, checking it against the photograph and against the undamaged left side of her face. The foundation went on smoothly, covering the gray pallor, bringing warmth back to the skin. I used a damp sponge to blend it, working in circular motions, making sure there were no streaks or patches. The bruising was harder to cover. Even with a heavy foundation, deep bruises can show through, creating dark shadows that look unnatural. I used a color corrector first, a peach-toned cream that neutralizes the purple and blue of the bruise, and then I layered foundation over it. It took 3 coats to get the coverage I needed, and even then, I could still see a faint shadow along her jawline. I made a note to adjust the lighting in the viewing room. Softer light, positioned at an angle, would minimize the shadow and make the reconstruction look more natural. I moved on to the details, the subtle shading around the eyes, the faint blush on the cheeks, the careful application of lip color. I used a brush with a fine tip for the lips, tracing the natural line, filling in the color with small, precise strokes. The lips were always the hardest part. Too much color, and they look garish. Too little, and the face looks dead. I needed to find the exact middle ground, the shade that suggested life without claiming it. By the time I finished the face, it was nearly midnight. I'd been working for 8 hours and my hands were cramping. The muscles in my shoulders ached from bending over the table, and my eyes burned from the bright lamp. But I wasn't done. I still had to style the hair, apply the final cosmetics, and do a full assessment in the morning light. Fluorescent light is unforgiving. It shows every flaw, every imperfection. I needed to see the work under those conditions before I could sign off on it. I covered the body with a sheet, turned off the lamp, and locked the workroom. The hallway outside was dark and quiet. The funeral home was empty at this hour. Everyone else had gone home hours ago. I walked through the building, my footsteps echoing on the tile floor, and I locked the front door behind me. When I walked out to the parking lot, I had a strange feeling, a prickling at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I turned and looked back at the building. The windows were dark. The parking lot was empty. There was no one there, just me and the wind and the sound of traffic on the distant highway. I shook it off and drove home. It was probably just fatigue. I'd been working long hours all week, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I needed sleep, a full night's rest, and I'd be fine in the morning. But when I got home, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and all I could see was that face, the shattered cheekbone, the crushed eye socket, the torn skin, the way it had looked before I started working on it, and the way it looked now, reconstructed, restored, almost human again. Almost, but not quite. There was something about the face that bothered me, something I couldn't quite identify, a detail that was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. I came back at 6 a.m., before the rest of the staff arrived. I like working in the early morning. The building is quiet, and the light is softer, easier on the eyes. I unlocked the workroom, turned on the lights, and pulled back the sheet. And I froze. The face had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone else might notice, but I'd spent 8 hours working on that face, memorizing every line, every contour, every subtle variation in tone. And I knew, immediately, that something was different. The right eye, the prosthetic one, had shifted. It was angled slightly upward now, looking toward the ceiling instead of straight ahead. The jaw, which I'd wired shut, looked looser. The mouth, which had been closed, was now slightly open. Just a crack, barely visible, but enough that I could see the edge of her teeth. I set down my supplies and approached the table slowly. I told myself there was a logical explanation. The wire might have slipped. The wax might have softened overnight, allowing the prosthetic to shift. The body might have settled, releasing tension in the jaw. All of those things were possible, plausible. I reached out and touched the prosthetic eye, intending to reposition it. And it blinked, not a slow mechanical movement, not a shift caused by my touch. It blinked. The eyelid, my eyelid, the one I'd reconstructed from wax and tissue, closed over the glass eye and then opened again. I yanked my hand back, my heart slamming against my ribs. I stared at the face, waiting for it to happen again. waiting to see if I'd imagined it. But the eye stayed open, fixed on the ceiling, unmoving. I took a breath, counted to 10, and reached out again. This time I touched the jaw, checking the wire, feeling for any looseness or instability. The jaw was secure, the wire was tight, but the mouth was definitely open. I could see it now, clearly. The lips had parted, and the teeth were visible. Not just the edge, the whole front row, top and bottom. I grabbed a pen light and shone it into the mouth, checking the interior. The tongue was in the wrong position. When I'd finished the reconstruction last night, the tongue had been flat, resting against the bottom of the mouth, the way it naturally does in death. Now it was pressed against the back of the teeth, like she was trying to push something out, or say something. I turned off the pen light and stepped back. My hands were shaking. I've worked on hundreds of bodies. I've seen every kind of post-mortem change you can imagine. I've seen bodies twitch from gas buildup. I've seen jaws drop open when rigor mortis releases. I've seen eyes sink back into the skull as the tissue dehydrates. All of that is normal, expected. But this was different. This wasn't a passive change. This was movement, deliberate, coordinated movement, like the body was trying to do something. I forced myself to focus. I had a job to do. The family was coming at 2 p.m. for a final viewing before the service. I had 8 hours to fix whatever had gone wrong, to make sure the face looked perfect, to make sure they could say goodbye without seeing anything that would haunt them later. I repositioned the prosthetic eye, using a small dab of adhesive to hold it in place. The adhesive was thick and sticky, and I worked it carefully around the edges of the socket, making sure the eye wouldn't shift again. I wired the jaw tighter, pulling it shut, making sure the teeth were no longer visible. The wire cut into my fingers as I twisted it, leaving small red marks on my skin. I checked the tongue, used a wooden tool to press it back into position, and then I sealed the lips with mortuary wax. I applied the wax in a thick layer, pressing it firmly into place, smoothing it with my fingers. When I was finished, the mouth was closed, secure, immovable. I checked the rest of the face, the skin, the cosmetics, the sutures. Everything looked good, professional, the way it was supposed to. I covered the body again and stepped back. The prickling feeling was back, stronger now. The sense that I wasn't alone in the room, that something was watching me. I looked around. The workroom was empty. The door was closed. The windows were covered with blinds. There was no one there, just me and the body and the smell of wax and formaldehyde. I tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to me like a second skin. I turned back to the table, intending to do one final check, and that's when I noticed the hands. They'd moved. Not a lot, just slightly. The left hand, which had been resting at her side, was now positioned higher, near her chest. The fingers were curled, like she was gripping something. But there was nothing in her hand. Nothing visible, anyway. I uncovered the body again and repositioned the hand. The skin was cool and firm, the way it should be. But as I moved the hand back down to her side, I felt resistance. Not a lot. Just a slight tension, like the muscles were fighting me. But that's impossible. The muscles were dead, embalmed. There's no mechanism for resistance in a dead body. I pressed harder, forcing the hand down, and the resistance vanished. The hand settled into place, and I arranged the fingers in a natural position. Then I covered the body again and walked to the other side of the room. I needed distance, needed to clear my head. I sat down at my workbench and pulled out the photograph the family had given me. I studied it, comparing the face in the picture to the work I'd done. The resemblance was good, close enough that the family would recognize her. Close enough that they'd be able to say goodbye. I spent the next hour styling the hair. The family had requested a simple style. Hair pulled back, the way she usually wore it. I worked carefully, using a brush and a light styling gel to smooth the hair into place. The hair was still slightly damp from the cleaning process, and it had a faint chemical smell. I combed it back from her face, gathering it at the nape of her neck, and secured it with a small elastic band. Then I used bobby pins to hold any loose strands in place. The work was meditative, almost soothing. It gave me something to focus on, something concrete and predictable. But every time I turned my back to reach for a tool or adjust the lighting, I felt it. That sensation of being watched, of someone standing just behind me, looking over my shoulder. I'd spin around and there'd be nothing, just the empty room, the covered body, the workbench with its neat rows of tools and cosmetics. I told myself I was tired, that I'd been working too much, sleeping too little, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got stronger. I finished the hair and moved on to the final cosmetic touches. A light dusting of powder to set the foundation, a touch of highlighter on the cheekbones, a final check of the lip color. I worked quickly, efficiently, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. When I was finished, I stepped back and looked at the face. It was perfect. The family would be pleased. They'd see their wife, their mother, their sister lying peacefully in the casket. They'd be able to say goodbye without the horror of seeing her injuries. That's what I'd been hired to do, and I'd done it well. At noon, I took a break. I needed to eat to get out of the workroom, to clear my head. I went to the staff lounge, made a cup of coffee, and sat by the window. The funeral director came in a few minutes later. He asked how the reconstruction was going. I told him it was fine, nearly finished. He nodded, said the family had called to confirm the viewing time, and then he left. I sat there for another 10 minutes, drinking my coffee, staring out the window at the parking lot. The sky was overcast, gray clouds hanging low over the trees. It looked like rain. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and went back to the workroom. When I pulled back the sheet, I knew immediately that something was wrong. The face had changed again. The prosthetic eye had shifted. The jaw had loosened. And the mouth was open, wide open. The lips pulled back, the teeth fully visible, the tongue pressed forward like she was trying to speak. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. This wasn't normal. This wasn't explainable. I'd wired the jaw shut, I'd sealed the lips, I'd done everything correctly. But the body was fighting me. It was undoing my work, rejecting the reconstruction. I grabbed my tools and started over. I repositioned the eye, applying even more adhesive this time, pressing it firmly into place. I tightened the jaw wire, pulling it so tight that I worried it might snap. I sealed the lips again, this time using more wax, applying it in thick layers, pressing it firmly into place. I worked fast, my hands moving on autopilot, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. Bodies don't move on their own. They don't resist reconstruction. There's always a rational explanation. Gases, muscle contractions, settling tissue. Always. But I couldn't think of one that fit what I was seeing. When I was finished, I stood there for a long moment, staring down at the face. It looked perfect, peaceful, exactly like the photograph. But I didn't trust it. I didn't trust the body to stay the way I'd left it. So I did something I'd never done before. I stayed in the room. I pulled up a chair and sat down beside the table. And I watched the face, looking for any sign of movement, any shift in the features. Minutes passed, 10, 20, 30. Nothing happened. The face stayed still, the eyes stayed closed, the mouth stayed shut. I started to relax, started to think that maybe I'd fixed it, that whatever had been causing the changes had stopped. Maybe the adhesive was finally strong enough. Maybe the wire was finally tight enough. Maybe the wax had sealed properly this time. And then the eye opened. Not the prosthetic eye. The real one. The left eye. The one I hadn't touched. The one that had been intact and undamaged. It opened slowly, the eyelid lifting, and the eye turned toward me. It was clouded, unfocused, the way eyes always are in death. But it was looking at me. I could feel it. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor, my breath coming in short gasps. The eye followed me. It tracked my movement, staying locked on my face even as I backed toward the door. I wanted to run. Wanted to get out of that room and never come back. But I couldn't. Because in less than 2 hours, a family was going to walk through the door expecting to see their wife, their mother, their sister lying peacefully in a casket. And if I ran, if I left the body like this, they'd see something else. Something wrong. Something that would destroy them. I forced myself to move forward. I approached the table, keeping my eyes on that open eye, and I reached out with a trembling hand. I touched the eyelid, intending to close it, to hold it shut, to do whatever I had to do to make it stop looking at me. And the moment my fingers made contact, the eye closed. Just like that. Smooth. Natural. Like it had never opened at all. I pulled my hand back and waited. 10 seconds, 20, 30. The eye stayed closed. I checked the rest of the face. Everything was in place. The jaw was secure, the mouth was shut, the prosthetic eye was angled correctly, everything looked perfect. But I didn't believe it. I grabbed the adhesive and applied a thin layer to the eyelid, sealing it shut. Then I did the same to the other eye. The prosthetic one. I sealed the mouth again. I checked every suture, every seam, every detail. And then I heard it. A sound, faint, barely audible. It was coming from the body, from the throat. A soft, rasping sound, like air moving through a narrow passage. I leaned closer, my ear near her mouth, listening. The sound continued, steady and rhythmic. And then it changed. It shaped itself into something recognizable. A word, or the beginning of a word. A syllable, formed by the movement of air and the position of the tongue. I jerked back, my heart racing. The body was making sounds. The dead woman was trying to speak. I stood there, frozen, listening. The sound came again, clearer this time. A whisper, so faint I could barely hear it. But it was there, unmistakable. A word I couldn't quite make out. I should have left, should have walked out of that room and called someone, the funeral director, a priest, anyone. But I didn't. I leaned closer again, straining to hear. The whisper came again, and this time I caught part of it. 2 syllables, soft, urgent. I couldn't understand what she was saying, but I could hear the tone. It wasn't angry, it wasn't threatening, it was pleading, like she was begging for something. I backed away from the table, my mind reeling. This wasn't possible. Dead bodies don't speak. They don't form words. There's no air in the lungs, no control over the vocal cords. It's biologically impossible. But I'd heard it. I'd heard her voice, faint and broken, trying to tell me something. I covered the body with the sheet and walked out of the room. I locked the door behind me and stood in the hallway, leaning against the wall, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking. My whole body was shaking. I needed to calm down, needed to think rationally. There had to be an explanation. Gas, escaping from the lungs. The sound of air moving through the throat. A trick of acoustics in the quiet room. Something. Anything. But none of those explanations felt right. None of them accounted for the word I'd heard. The syllables, the tone. I looked at my watch. 15:45 until the family arrived. I had to pull myself together. Had to go back in that room and make sure everything was ready. I took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and went back inside. The body was exactly as I'd left it, covered with the sheet. Still, silent. I approached the table slowly, listening for any sound. Nothing, just the hum of the ventilation system and the faint tick of the clock on the wall. I pulled back the sheet and looked at the face. Perfect, peaceful. The eyes were closed, the mouth was shut. Everything was in place. I checked the hands. They were positioned correctly, resting at her sides. I checked the hair, smooth, neat, exactly as the family had requested. Everything was ready. I covered the body again and stepped back. The prickling feeling was gone. The sense of being watched had faded. The room felt normal again, empty, just me and the tools and the quiet. The family arrived at 2. I stood in the back of the viewing room, watching as they approached the casket. The husband saw her first. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with graying hair and eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in days. He stood there for a long moment, just looking, and then he reached out and touched her hand. His fingers were shaking. He started to cry, quiet tears running down his face, and his daughters stood beside him, their arms around his shoulders. One of the daughters leaned down and kissed her mother's forehead. The other placed a small bouquet of flowers on the casket lid. They stayed for 20 minutes, and then they stepped back. The funeral director guided them to the chairs, offered them water, spoke to them in quiet, soothing tones. When they left, the funeral director thanked me, said I'd done beautiful work, said the family was grateful. They'd told him it looked just like her, that they could see her smile in the shape of her mouth, that they could recognize her in every detail. I nodded, accepted the compliment, and then I went back to the workroom. I needed to see the body one more time, needed to confirm that the seals had held, that nothing had shifted during the viewing. I pulled back the sheet and looked down at the face. The eyes were open. Both of them. The real eye and the prosthetic eye, both staring up at the ceiling. The mouth was open, the lips pulled back, the teeth visible, and the tongue. The tongue was pressed against the roof of the mouth, shaped like it was forming a word. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just stood there looking down at the face, and I understood. The body wasn't fighting me. It was trying to tell me something, trying to communicate in the only way it could. I leaned closer, trying to see the shape of the tongue, trying to understand what word it was forming. The position was clear now. The tongue was arched, pressed against the palate, forming a specific sound. A consonant followed by a vowel. I could almost hear it in my mind, the phantom sound of a word that was never spoken aloud. But I couldn't identify it, couldn't decode the message. The mouth wasn't open wide enough. The tongue wasn't positioned clearly enough for me to be certain. I could have opened the mouth wider, could have adjusted the tongue, could have tried to decode whatever message the body was trying to send. But I didn't. Because I realized in that moment that I didn't want to know. I didn't want to hear what the dead had to say. Maybe it was a message for the family. Maybe it was something she'd wanted to tell them before she died, something she'd left unsaid. Or maybe it was something else, something meant only for me, a warning, a plea, a secret that should have stayed buried. I didn't know, and I didn't want to find out. Because some knowledge is too heavy to carry, some truths are too dark to live with. I closed the eyes again. I closed the mouth. I smoothed the sheet back over the body and I walked out of the workroom. I locked the door behind me and I left the building. I got in my car and I drove home, and I didn't look back. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. I kept seeing that face, the eyes staring at the ceiling. The mouth open, the tongue shaped around a word I'll never understand. I tried to convince myself it was stress, fatigue, the result of too many hours spent in that cold, silent room with the dead. But I knew better. I'd seen what I'd seen, and I couldn't unsee it. The next day, the body was buried. I wasn't there, I didn't attend the service, I don't attend services anymore, I just do the work. I reconstruct the faces. I make the dead look peaceful. And I try not to think about what happens when I leave the room, about whether the eyes open, whether the mouths move, whether the bodies try to speak. Because I don't want to know. I don't want to hear. I just want to do my job and go home and forget. But I can't forget. Because every time I close my eyes, I see that face. I see the eyes staring at the ceiling. I see the mouth open, the tongue shaped around a word I'll never understand, and I wonder what she was trying to say. What message she was trying to send. What she needed me to know before they put her in the ground and covered her with dirt. I still do restorative work. I'm still good at it. The families still thank me. The funeral directors still ask for me by name. But I've changed the way I work. I don't stay in the room anymore. I don't watch the bodies. I do the reconstruction, and then I leave. I cover them with a sheet, I lock the door, and I walk away. And I don't come back until the viewing, because I've learned that some things are better left unseen. Some questions are better left unasked, and some messages from the dead are meant to stay unheard. I don't know what she was trying to tell me, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed and the house is quiet, I wonder if she's still trying. If somewhere in the ground, beneath 6 feet of earth and a layer of concrete, her mouth is still open. Her tongue is still forming that word. Her eyes are still searching for someone to listen. And I wonder if that's what happens to all of them. All the bodies I've worked on, all the faces I've reconstructed. I wonder if they're all still down there trying to speak, waiting for someone to hear. The thought keeps me awake most nights. I lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, and I think about all the faces I've touched, all the eyes I've closed, all the mouths I've sealed shut. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, each one carefully prepared, meticulously reconstructed, made ready for viewing. And I wonder how many of them tried to speak, how many of them had messages they needed to deliver, how many of them opened their eyes in the dark, when no one was watching, and tried to tell me something I was too afraid to hear. There was a woman 3 years ago before this case. She'd died of cancer, her body wasted and frail. The family wanted an open casket, but the disease had ravaged her face. I spent 12 hours reconstructing her features, building up the hollows with wax, restoring color to the gray skin. When I finished, she looked peaceful, beautiful even. The family was overjoyed. They told me I'd given them a gift, a final memory of their mother as she'd been before the illness. But the night before the funeral, I came back to the funeral home to do a final check. And when I pulled back the sheet, her mouth was open, wide open like she was screaming. I closed it, sealed it with wax, and told myself it was normal settling. But now I wonder, was she trying to tell me something? Was there a message I missed? And there was a man, 5 years ago. He'd drowned. The water had done terrible things to his face, bloating the tissue, distorting the features. I worked for 2 days to make him look human again. The family was grateful. They said I'd performed a miracle. But on the morning of the funeral, I found him with his eyes open, both of them staring at the ceiling. I closed them, sealed them, and blamed it on the embalming fluid breaking down. But what if it wasn't? What if he'd been trying to show me something? What if all of them have been trying to communicate, and I've been too focused on the technical work to notice? I've started keeping a journal. Every body I work on, I write down the details, the injuries, the reconstruction process, the final appearance. and I note anything unusual. Any changes that occur overnight, any sounds I hear, any feelings I have while I'm working. The journal is filling up fast. More than half the entries have notes about unexpected changes. Eyes opening, mouths shifting, hands moving. I tell myself it's all explainable. Gas buildup, tissue settling, temperature fluctuations. But the explanations feel hollow now. They don't account for the patterns I'm seeing, the consistency of the changes, the deliberate nature of the movements. Last week, I worked on a young man who'd died in a motorcycle accident. The damage was extensive. I had to rebuild most of his face from scratch. When I finished, he looked peaceful, young, handsome, the way his mother wanted to remember him. But the next morning, his mouth was open, and inside I found something, a small object, wedged between his teeth. It was a coin, an old penny, worn smooth, the kind someone might carry for luck. I removed it, examined it, and put it in a small evidence bag. I didn't tell anyone about it, didn't include it in my notes, because I couldn't explain how it got there. The body had been in a locked room. No one had access except me, and I certainly hadn't put a penny in his mouth. I still have the coin. It's in my desk drawer at home, in the evidence bag. Sometimes I take it out and look at it, turning it over in my fingers, trying to make sense of it. Was it already in his mouth, and I just missed it during the initial examination? That's possible. I'm thorough, but I'm not perfect. Or did someone else put it there, a family member maybe, during a private viewing? But the room had been locked. The cameras showed no one entering. So where did it come from, and why? What was the significance of a worn penny placed in a dead man's mouth? I don't know, and I'm starting to think I'll never know, because the dead don't explain themselves. They just leave clues, small, cryptic signs that could mean everything or nothing. And we, the living, are left to interpret them, to decide what's real and what's imagination. I'm tired of interpreting, tired of second-guessing, tired of lying awake at night, wondering if the bodies I've worked on are at peace or if they're still trying to speak. Still trying to deliver messages that no one will ever hear. I've thought about quitting, finding a different line of work, something that doesn't involve death and reconstruction and the terrible intimacy of touching the dead. But I don't know what else I'd do. This is all I've ever known. This is what I'm good at. And despite everything, despite the fear and the doubt and the sleepless nights, there's a part of me that still believes in the work, that still thinks it matters, because the families need it. They need to see their loved ones at peace. They need that final image to carry with them, to remember. And I can give them that, even if it costs me something, even if it haunts me. So I'll keep working. I'll keep reconstructing the faces of the dead. I'll keep sealing their eyes and mouths, keep positioning their hands, keep making them look peaceful and beautiful and ready for goodbye. And I'll try not to think about what happens after I leave the room, about whether they open their eyes in the dark, about whether they whisper words that no one hears, about whether they're trying to tell us something important, something urgent, something that could change everything if only we'd listen. But I won't listen, I can't, because the alternative, the possibility that the dead are conscious, aware, trapped in their failing bodies, desperate to communicate, is too terrible to consider. So I'll choose to believe in the rational explanations. I'll choose to believe that bodies are just bodies, that death is final, that the movements I see are nothing more than the mechanical processes of decay. I'll choose to believe that even though I know, deep down, that it might not be true. And every time I close a dead person's eyes, every time I seal their mouth shut, every time I cover them with a sheet and walk away, I'll whisper a silent apology. I'm sorry I can't hear you. I'm sorry I can't understand. I'm sorry I'm too afraid to listen. I hope, wherever you are, that you find peace, that you find someone who can hear what I cannot, that you find a way to deliver your message, even if it's not through me. I hope that, I really do. But I don't think I'll ever know for sure, and maybe that's for the best.